So the environment and the people who depend on the environment have both been tremendously under an onslaught over the last few years. It's not as if we didn't have the environment as being an intrinsic part of the policy making that drove certain anti-people policies over the years, but I think since 2014, natural resource-based communities, which includes forest workers, fish workers, and others who rely on the natural environment as their primary livelihood and subsistence means, have been particularly at the receiving end of policies by the Modi government. And I think the whole agenda for accelerating certain forms of development has been accelerated in the second term. There was definitely an emboldenment that the winning of the second term did. And what has happened is that with a lopsided majority in the parliament, in both the lower house and the upper house, there has been a complete dilution of procedures, whether that involves how bills are debated, how they are introduced, how they are discussed, how they are passed. Parliamentary standing committees are bypassed. And this has meant that even the most basic safeguards which we had in place, which were far from being ideal, have definitely got far worsened over the last year and a half in the second term. So just to give an example, we have the environmental impact assessment, which is a basic framework that looks at having checks and balances for development projects that can have an environmental impact. And what we are seeing is that in the middle of the pandemic, a whole new EIA 2020 draft was introduced. In fact, it was introduced just before the lockdown, and then it went through a whole process of being a process which was very exclusionary. And this has meant that even though the EIA is not finalized, it gives us an insight into what is happening with environmental protection in India. We have recent studies regarding the government's own public sector enterprises, such as the National Thermal Power Corporation, which has been at the kind of delivering end of terrible policies against scheduled tribe communities in central India's forests, and again driven by the kind of financial nature of investments in the energy sector, been driving a lot of displacement and dispossession. Similarly, fish workers who rely on the oceans and the coasts as their primary livelihood spaces have seen new notifications regarding coastal development and regulation, new fisheries policies, new fisheries schemes, all of which have been pushed through at times when people have been unable to engage with policy processes. So I think it's not just the fact that we've had a second term of the Modi government. I think it's also very clear that we've had a second term in which almost all of 2020 has been under some form of lockdown or exclusion. And this has really aided the agenda of taking a lot of the exclusionary agenda ahead. And so, at least looking from large people's movements which rely on rivers, mountains, forests, streams, ponds, as, primary spaces where they exist and which they rely on, are under capture from both corporate firms, from the state in itself, and also policies such as the privatization of the railways, the financialization of energy, which end up kind of setting in motion policies that ultimately leave out the primary communities in that area. And we're looking down a deep, dark hole in terms of socio-ecologies and in terms of the environment, where if we keep going down this path, we're looking at a very accelerated and sudden demise in the rights of the people who live with nature, with environment, and really the shift to casualization, to informal, precarious jobs, to becoming refugees of climate change, and to really bearing the brunt of India's new development.